When Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, he left behind a political vacuum. No succession plan, no designated heir, and no clear order. What followed was a relentless power struggle to decide who would inherit the legacy of one of history's greatest conquerors. This is the story of how a Macedonian warlord transformed himself into Pharaoh, fused Greek ambition with Egyptian tradition, and laid the foundation for a dynasty that would rule for 300 years, ending only with the death of Cleopatra and the dawn of Roman rule. So how did a former bodyguard of Alexander the Great carve out one of the longest-lasting Hellenistic kingdoms? And what made Egypt, of all places, the heart of a Greek world? And so begins the story of how a Macedonian general planted the seeds of a dynasty along the Nile. When Alexander died in 323 BC, the fate of his vast empire fell to Perdiccas, the commander of the cavalry. On Alexander's deathbed, Perdiccas was given the king's signet ring, seen by many as a possible transfer of power. Hoping to keep the empire united, Perdiccas proposed delaying the decision of a successor until the birth of Alexander's child with Roxanne, the future Alexander IV. But not everyone supported this plan. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most trusted men, opposed it and instead pushed to divide the empire among the leading commanders. What followed was a fragile balance of alliances among the new rulers, constantly shifting between war and uneasy peace. These struggles, lasting over 30 years, came to be known as the Wars of the Diadochi, the Wars of the Successors. At the empire's division, Ptolemy maneuvered to secure Egypt, the richest province of Alexander's realm. By luck or foresight, Ptolemy understood Egypt's strategic value. Its fertile Nile valley, its wealth, and its defensible borders could provide a power base for an ambitious ruler. He arrived in Egypt as its new governor and quickly began laying the groundwork for independent rule. From the outset, Ptolemy acted with shrewd pragmatism. Ancient sources note that Ptolemy, by his wise exertions in Egypt, was acquiring great power. He had secured the favor of the Egyptians by his extraordinary prudence. He had attached the neighboring princes by acts of kindness and courtesy. In practice, this meant Ptolemy respected Egyptian religious traditions and worked with the native priesthood, even as he installed Macedonian Greeks in key military and administrative positions. Early in his reign, Ptolemy also moved beyond Egypt's borders to secure territories of strategic importance. To the west, he extended his domain into Cyrenaica, modern-day eastern Libya, a region that controlled key trade routes along the Mediterranean coast and acted as a natural buffer against the powers in North Africa. By 321 BC, however, his bold actions provoked a crisis. Ptolemy had intercepted Alexander's funeral cortege, diverting it from its way to Macedon and bringing Alexander's mummified body to Egypt. By tradition, Macedonian kings reinforced their claim to the throne by burying their predecessor. Likely aiming to block Perdiccas from doing just that, Ptolemy went to great lengths to secure possession of Alexander's body. Greek historian Diodorus Siculus describes how Ptolemy met the funeral procession. With an army as far as Syria and, receiving the body, deemed it worthy of the greatest consideration. He decided to entomb it in the city that had been founded by Alexander himself, which lacked little of being the most renowned of the cities of the inhabited earth. He carried Alexander's body to Memphis in Egypt and later to the city of Alexandria, which Alexander himself had founded on the Nile Delta. Ptolemy built an extravagant tomb and shrine for Alexander in Alexandria and honored him with plentiful sacrifices. Crowds flocked to Alexandria, and many of Alexander's veterans and courtiers chose to serve under Ptolemy, impressed by his devotion to their former king. This clever act gave Ptolemy a mantle of legitimacy and a kind of spiritual patronage in the eyes of both Egyptians and Macedonians. But it also made him a target. The regent of the empire, Perdiccas, saw Ptolemy's growing power with alarm. In 320 BC, Perdiccas marched into Egypt with a royal army to unseat him. A dramatic showdown ensued along the Nile. Directly opposite the city of Memphis, Perdiccas ordered the crossing to commence. His best troops, his Macedonian veterans, formed the vanguard. However, as soon as these heavily armed soldiers began wading into the waterway, they encountered difficulty. At its center, the river was very deep, with the water coming up to the soldiers' necks. Relying on his prior campaigns with Alexander, Perdiccas stationed elephants upstream to slow the river's current and assist his troops in crossing. However, this tactic had unintended effects. As the elephants pressed into the Nile's sandy bed, they loosened the river floor, and the constant troop movement stirred up more sediment, causing water levels to rise unexpectedly. Both men and animals soon found themselves slowly sinking as the ground beneath them became unstable. The rising water baffled the troops and their commanders. With each passing minute, the current grew stronger and more dangerous. Perdiccas eventually ordered a stop to the crossing, but by then, a sizable group of his elite soldiers was already stranded, cut off from the main force, and worse trouble was brewing. As the officers considered their limited options, a massive cloud of dust appeared on the western bank. It looked like an enemy army was rapidly approaching. The threat seemed real and directly aimed at the isolated soldiers on the island. Fearing an ambush, Perdiccas made a panicked decision. He ordered the men on the island to retreat immediately, hoping to save them before the enemy arrived. The troops obeyed, diving into the turbulent waters in a desperate attempt to swim back. Those who discarded their weapons and armor had the best chance of surviving the return, but many were not so lucky. Poor swimmers were dragged under, while others were swept far downstream and captured by enemy forces awaiting on the western shore. Farther along the river, some suffered even worse fates. Carried off by the current, they fell prey to Nile predators, crocodiles, and even aggressive hippopotami. It was a gruesome end for seasoned warriors who had survived countless campaigns, only to be devoured by the river's deadly wildlife. The panic that drove Perdiccas' decision was based on a clever illusion. The dust cloud wasn't an army at all, just livestock driven by herders and cavalry to stir up confusion. Ptolemy had hoped this trick would mislead Perdiccas into retreating, and it worked perfectly. By the time the chaos ended, over 2,000 of Perdiccas' soldiers were dead, half of them torn apart by the river's beasts. The scale of the disaster left his army demoralized and furious. That same night, Perdiccas was killed by his own men, ending the career of one of Alexander's most powerful heirs. Ptolemy had repelled the invasion without a pitched battle. After Perdiccas' death, the victors met to redistribute power, and Ptolemy, content with Egypt, refused offers to become the new imperial regent. Antigonus was one of Alexander's most powerful generals and emerged as a dominant figure after Perdiccas' collapse. He controlled large parts of Asia and aimed to reunite the empire under his sole rule. His son Demetrius was a bold military commander who campaigned alongside him and challenged rival successors like Ptolemy and Seleucus. The decades following Alexander's death were marked by constant wars among his successors. Ptolemy fortified Egypt's natural defenses and largely avoided overextending himself in Asia's conflicts. When other Diadochi clashed, Ptolemy often intervened just enough to tip the balance, then pulled back to safety. He fought in the Levant, claiming Palestine and Phoenicia for a time, and he established naval control over the eastern Mediterranean, including Cyprus. Ptolemy's strategy was to maintain a balance of power, guaranteeing the safety of his own territory. Unlike his rivals, Ptolemy never sought to resurrect Alexander's entire empire. He focused on making his own kingdom undefeatable. In 312 BC, at the Battle of Gaza, Ptolemy, in alliance with Seleucus of Babylon, defeated Antigonus' son Demetrius, a victory that allowed Seleucus to claim control of Babylon and the east. By 305 BC, events pushed Ptolemy to take a momentous step. Antigonus had declared himself king in Asia. Not to be outdone, Ptolemy's army in Egypt acclaimed him King Ptolemy I. In this way, Ptolemy shed the last pretense of loyalty to a united empire and openly founded an independent monarchy. He took the epithet Soter, meaning savior, after his fleet aided the people of Rhodes in 304 BC. Ptolemy had sent ships and supplies to help Rhodes withstand a siege by Demetrius. Grateful, the Rhodians bestowed divine honors on him as their savior. Thus, by the end of the 4th century BC, Ptolemy I had survived all the upheavals and emerged as an established monarch. The wars among Alexander's successors reached their decisive climax in 301 BC on the plains of Ipsus in Phrygia. There, the greatest armies of the Diadochi assembled, each determined to claim Alexander's legacy. At the heart of the struggle stood the war elephants. Seleucus's massive force of beasts far outnumbered those of Antigonus and proved the turning point of the battle. Cut off from his cavalry and overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers, Antigonus fell amidst the fighting, struck down at the age of 80. With his death, the dream of reunifying Alexander's empire perished as well. In its place, a new political order emerged. The empire was carved into a new balance of power. Lysimachus took control of Thrace and much of Asia Minor, Seleucus gained vast territories in Asia, and Cassander maintained his hold over Macedonia and Greece. Ptolemaic Egypt remained a major power to the south. Though shifting alliances and further wars lay ahead, the Battle of Ipsus ensured that Alexander's empire would never again be reunited under a single ruler. In the unsettled aftermath, Ptolemy moved swiftly to occupy Jerusalem and southern Syria. Seleucus, however, claimed the region as his own, and their rivalry over this frontier would transpire for years to come. Ptolemy now turned to the task of governing Egypt and blending Greek and Egyptian traditions to legitimize his dynasty. Although ethnically Macedonian Greek, the Ptolemies embraced the role of Pharaoh to win acceptance from their Egyptian subjects. Ptolemy and his successors donned the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt in ceremonies and were depicted in Egyptian temples in the traditional style of the pharaohs. At the same time, they remained thoroughly Hellenistic, maintaining the Greek language and culture at court. Thousands of Greeks and Macedonians settled in Egypt's new cities, especially Alexandria, which became the vibrant capital of the kingdom. Alexandria itself was a lasting triumph of this era. Founded by Alexander in 331 BC, it was modest at his death, but Ptolemy made it the royal capital and a showcase of Greek urban life on Egyptian soil. He and his son Ptolemy II built the city into a grand metropolis, laying out a grid of broad avenues, erecting palaces and temples, and promoting it as the new cultural center of the Hellenistic world. The famous Library of Alexandria and the museum were likely initiated during their reigns, drawing scholars, poets, and philosophers from across the Mediterranean. Ptolemy also embarked on a policy of blending religious practices. He introduced the worship of Serapis, a hybrid Greco-Egyptian deity created by combining aspects of the Egyptian god Osiris Apis with attributes of Greek Zeus or Hades as a patron god of Alexandria. In economic and administrative terms, Ptolemaic Egypt was highly centralized. Ptolemy retained many practices of earlier Egyptian bureaucracy, record-keeping, tax collection, irrigation management, while inserting Greek officials at the top. The Nile's annual floods continued to be the lifeblood of agriculture, and the Ptolemies took care to maintain and improve the irrigation system, ensuring abundant grain harvests that made Egypt wealthy. They turned Egypt into the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Ptolemy built a strong navy, which for a time dominated the eastern Mediterranean. This naval strength even allowed him to play protector of Greece. One historian notes that under Ptolemy II, Egypt became the preeminent naval power in the region, a trend his father had begun. By the end of Ptolemy's long reign, Egypt was a unique fusion of Greek and Egyptian elements. The ruling class spoke Greek and congregated in cities, while the countryside remained largely Egyptian in population, language, and traditions. Yet there was mutual influence. Greeks began to adopt Egyptian religious iconography, and Egyptians in the cities learned Greek and gained opportunities in the new system. For much of the 3rd century BC, Ptolemaic Egypt stood as a wealthy, cosmopolitan, and formidable kingdom, serving as a counterweight in the shifting balance of Hellenistic power, its armies even drawing on Galatian mercenaries like those pictured here. Diplomatically, Ptolemy pioneered a policy of dynastic marriages and alliances. For instance, he married off daughters to the Seleucid court and others to Macedonian princes to secure peace. Ptolemy I died in 282 BC at about 84 years of age. a remarkably old age in that era, and a testament perhaps to the stability he achieved. Uniquely, he chose to abdicate a few years before his death, handing power to his chosen son Ptolemy II to ensure an orderly succession while he was still alive. This smooth transfer set the stage for the Ptolemaic dynasty's unbroken rule in Egypt. The dynasty founded by Ptolemy endured for nearly 3 centuries. Its male rulers all bore the name Ptolemy, while its queens often carried dynastic names such as Arsinoe, Berenice, or Cleopatra. The line came to its dramatic end with the famous death of Cleopatra in 30 BC, when Egypt was finally absorbed into the Roman Empire. Ptolemy's legacy was the establishment of a Greco-Egyptian kingdom that outlasted all other successor states. He had risen from being one of Alexander's companions to a king in his own right, and through cautious generalship, political acumen, and cultural diplomacy, he ensured that Egypt, under Greek rule, thrived for generations. In the end, Ptolemy secured Egypt's place as a bastion of Hellenistic culture, a land where pharaohs spoke Greek and libraries swelled with the knowledge of the world. A remarkable fusion born of war, ambition, and intelligent rule. Ptolemy's leadership ensured that the torch of Alexander's empire burned on in Egypt, illuminating a new era of Hellenistic civilization along the Nile.